Hi, welcome to another session on the Rewiring Your Brain World Summit. My name is Fleet Mull, your co-host for this session, and I'm really happy to be here today with Dr. James Doty. Welcome, Dr. Doty.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being willing to be part of our summit. So I'm going to share a bit of your bio, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. So James Doty, MD, is an adjunct professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at Stanford University of Medicine and the founder and director of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, or CCARE, at Stanford University, which His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the founding benefactor of. He works with a variety of scientists from a number of disciplines examining the neural basis for compassion and altruism. Through CCARE, Dr. Doty has overseen the development of a variety of techniques, apps, and programs to address issues of mental health, stress, anxiety, and burnout. He's also the founder and CEO of Happy.ai, a healthcare company focused on creating a digital platform that uses artificial intelligence combined with a human avatar to treat mental health issues. He is also the senior editor of the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science. Dr. Doty is an inventor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, having given support to charitable organizations supporting peace initiatives, funded health clinics throughout the world, created programs for the disabled, and supported programs for adolescents affected by AIDS and HIV. He has supported research, providing scholarships and endowed chairs at multiple universities. He is presently focusing on developing educational programs for children through K through 12 education focused on compassion, empathy, and social emotional learning. His book, Into the Magic Shop, A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart, a New York Times bestseller, which has now been translated into 40 languages and editions. It also served as the basis for the third album, Love Yourself, Here, by the famous K-pop group BTS. He is presently completing his next book, Mind Magic, The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. Dr. Doty is on the board of a number of nonprofits and former chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation and the former vice chair of the Charter for Compassion. He is also an advisor to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's Archwell Foundation. Dr. Doty's work has been cited in numerous media, including Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, ABC, and many others. He speaks around the world on the neuroscience and health benefits of compassion. So I think our audience can well understand now why we're really excited to have you to be part of this summit. So to begin with, Dr. Doty, maybe you could tell us a bit about your background. How did you become a neurosurgeon and with a particular interest in compassion and altruism?
Well, like so many people, who I became ultimately is a manifestation of where I began. And in my own situation, I actually grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother, she had a stroke when I was a child and was partially paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, and was chronically depressed, leading to the point where she attempted suicide multiple times. And obviously, that's not the ideal situation for a child to grow up in. But what happened to me was at the age of 12, where I was filled with a sense of hopelessness and despair, I actually walked into a magic shop, believe it or not. And what would happen when things began to get really difficult at home is that I would get on my bicycle and oftentimes ride as fast and as far away as I could to get away from the situation. And on one of those bike rides, I ended up outside of a strip mall, and in that strip mall was a magic shop. And I walked in, and there was a woman in her 50s with long, flowing gray hair, wearing a bluish muumuu, if you remember what that term means. And she had these glasses perched on the end of her nose, held by a chain. And she looked up at me and had this radiant smile, one that just embraced you. And I asked her about magic, and she said, well, this is my son's shop. I don't know anything about magic. But we ended up conversing. And interestingly, at that time, I would really not share any facts about myself because, of course, I was ashamed of my background and the fact that I was poor. But in the case with her, I was actually quite honest. And this led to a more in-depth discussion about my background and in some ways my hopes and aspirations. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, she said to me, I really like you. I'm here for another 6 weeks. And if you show up, I'll teach you something that I think could really help you. And I did show up. And what she taught me, if you will, was a mindfulness practice combined with a self-compassion practice and ultimately a way to see the world through the lens of compassion, as well as taught me a technique of visualization or manifestation. And that interaction with her fundamentally really changed the trajectory of my life. Now, what happened after that was I didn't believe that I had the opportunity or even the ability to go to college. But from what she taught me, that changed. And I ended up applying to college and got accepted. I ultimately got accepted to medical school. And interestingly, this was without a degree and with a grade point average of 2.53. I graduated from medical school and then was accepted into a neurosurgery residency. Now, I had started out wanting to be a family practice doctor because I had this vision of caring for the elderly as well as delivering babies and everything in between. But realistically, at least in my case, it seemed as though, especially in an urban environment, I would simply be a referring doctor to other specialists. And after a lot of introspection, I also realized that my personality was more suited to be a surgeon. And to pay for medical school, I had actually joined the military. And during a rotation, I actually rotated on the neurosurgery service, and I found it very fascinating, very demanding, and it really connected with me. And the individuals who I was rotating with, they encouraged me to apply. And as I said, I was in the Army, so I applied to the neurosurgery residency. Now, the interesting thing was that I took my vacation time, flew out there to do this rotation, and then I met with the chairman of the department, and he said to me, well, Jim, we'd love to have you here, but as you know, there's a 3-year wait. So if you're going to do the residency, you will have to go out as a general medical officer for 3 years. And then after that, you'll be accepted because all those slots are already assigned. And it's funny because I looked at him and I said, well, that's not acceptable. And he laughed. He said, well, that's the way it is. So what's interesting, though, is that the individual who was slotted for that position the following year, he had been dating the head nurse of the neurosurgery floor. And they ended up breaking up. And at least her perspective was that he was stalking her. And she complained to the chairman, and the chairman canceled his residency, and he was sent to Korea. And since everyone else had been assigned to their positions already, I was offered that position and actually ended up taking that position. And so I didn't have to wait at all. And that's the story of how I became a neurosurgeon.
Wow, what an amazing story. That encounter that you had with that benevolent woman that came into your life, a really kind of an angelic visitation of sorts. And the rest of it was serendipity, auspicious coincidence, or maybe like a whole nother conversation we could have on the science of manifestation. They're quite a story. Amazing. So I know some of that story is in your book. Curious, were you surprised when your book became a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller, and how the appeal that it had for people?
Yeah, actually, I was. And it's interesting because I had been approached previously about writing a book based on stories I had told to audiences in regard to the work I was doing at CCARE. And I had always refused because I was in the middle of my neurosurgical career, as well as running this center and doing other things, of course. And what happened was that I was invited to Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday party, and which was quite extraordinary. There were only about 200 people there. It was a 3-day event. Bono did a performance actually inside the church during a service. And the second day was a book launch party for a book that Tutu's daughter, Impa, had done with a journalist. And at that party, an individual walked up to me and introduced himself. And the only reason I remembered him was because he was about 6'7" and a very handsome fellow. And he stuck in my mind. And about a month later, I was giving a lecture in Stanford, and I look out in the audience, and lo and behold, he's there. And I was going to say something to him, but somebody was asking me a question afterward, and I looked up and he was gone. Long story short, he ended up being invited to a book launch party for a friend of mine. And there he came up to me, introduced himself, and said, listen, I'm a big fan of yours. I've been following you for 3 years, and I think your message is profound, and I'd really love to do a book with you. I'm a literary agent. And he said, and really the big motivator is that my father is quite elderly, and I've shown him some of your work, and I would love to give this book to him as a gift to him. So, of course, that was quite moving to me. And I said, okay, I'll do it. Well, it turned out he was Tutu's agent, Nelson Mandela's and Richard Branson's. So obviously very good company. And so he and I worked together on an outline, and ultimately that became the book. But I had no idea how people would respond to it. Certainly, my view was if it helped one person, I would be quite happy. And obviously, it took a life of its own. And really, I receive still, after 5 or 6 years, well, I guess it's now 7 or 8 years, emails every day from people all over the world thanking me for doing that book. So it's been very gratifying. And also, it's been a bestseller in Russia, Romania, Poland, South Korea, United Arab Emirates. So it's been an extraordinary journey, actually.
Wow, another amazing story. Your life seems to be full of serendipity in that way. Really, really, really wonderful. Well, some things are just meant to happen, right? And obviously that book was meant to come into the world. So, Dr. Doty, at this summit, we're exploring the idea of rewiring our brains. Some people talk about brain hacking, other similar ways of talking about it, for enhanced health and well-being, for enhanced life performance, for happiness, cultivating pro-social qualities like your work around compassion, altruism, and so forth. So I'm curious about, what does the idea of rewiring your brain mean to you? And, are there any misconceptions around that are out there in the popular culture? But let's get started with your sense of what's possible in terms of rewiring the brain.
Sure. Well, certainly, there's no question that that's possible. Now, you also have to understand, though, there is a difference on some level, depending on what event happens. As an example, if you damage your brain in certain areas, you cannot rewire that oftentimes. And this is the case frequently with people who've had a stroke that has affected their speech center, or that has affected their motor functions, let's say in an extremity. While you may improve somewhat, generally speaking, you don't get it all back, if any of it back. That being said, though, there is no question that we have the power to rewire our brains in certain areas. And in some ways, this goes back to manifestation. And I know this isn't about manifestation, but the reality is that we receive about 100 million bits of information a second from our sensory organs. And of course, that is the way in which we interact with our universe. And on a conscious level, we're only able to process about 50 to 100 bits of information a second on a conscious level, which means that, one, most of that information goes into maintaining our bodily functions or our hemostasis. But there are parts of our brain, which are called cognitive networks, which this information can be directed towards. And one of those areas is called the attention network. One is called the salience network. One is called the central executive control network. And the other is the default mode network. But without going into too much detail, all of us every day are manifesting things. The reality, though, is most of us do it extraordinarily inefficiently. And with certain types of training, you can actually make that a much more efficient process. And this isn't pseudoscience or the law of attractions. It's just how the brain works. And so what Ruth, the woman in the magic shop, taught me was a technique which now is commonly used by sports psychologists, a visualization type of technique, which is reinforced oftentimes with inputting that data through various techniques such as writing them down, visualizing the activity, reading what it is you wish to accomplish. And that can dramatically increase your ability to manifest. And in some ways, my life has been a method of manifesting different things which were important to me. Now, certainly, I don't want to give people the impression that everything I manifested or everything I wanted was magically manifested, because that's not the case whatsoever. Obviously, this has to do with the timing being right and a whole variety of other factors. But I would say that more likely than not, if you use these types of techniques, it is more likely that they will manifest.
Wow. So, yeah, there's so much to say about that. I'm actually, you've inspired me. I think at some point we'll do a summit on the real science of manifestation, because there is a lot out there with The Secret and all that. And there's probably an overlapping gray area between the real science of manifestation and some of the, what might be called pseudoscience. But it is, the brain is a powerful thing. The mind is a powerful thing. And so I'm curious, focusing on your work on altruism and compassion, based on your research, would it be fair to say that we can rewire our brains to become more compassionate, altruistic, for our kind of, not the default mode network, but our default way of being, to be more compassionate and altruistic, and also that acting compassionately or acting altruistically actually does rewire our brain. So is that fair to say? Could you explore that territory a little bit?
Sure. No, I think you're absolutely correct. So first of all, like so many other human attributes, a portion of that is related to our genetic predisposition. As an example, people like the Dalai Lama probably was born being very compassionate. But there are others who have not had that maximally occur, if you will. And what I mean by that is, if you think of an Olympic athlete, if I wanted to, let's say, run a mile under 4 minutes or do some extraordinary physical activity, the likelihood of me being at that extraordinary level is low. And the reason is because oftentimes these high-performing athletes have their genetics match their interests, and they are able then to excel. But for the average person, most of us have not manifested maximally our ability to be compassionate. And in some ways, it's like exercising and it being a muscle. If you don't exercise the muscle doesn't get bigger. And so we know that through different types of practices, one of those, as an example, being a meditation type of practice, that we can actually increase our capacity to be compassionate. But why, I guess, is an important question. And it goes back to our evolution as a species. When we are born, unlike other species, we don't run off into the forest or the jungle or swim away. We have to be cared for a number of years. And of course, this requires an immense amount of time, effort, and resource utilization from the parents. Well, unless there is some other motivator, why would they do it? And the reason is that when you are kind, when you're compassionate, when you're caring, when you recognize the suffering of another, especially your offspring, you are rewarded. And those areas in your brain associated with a pleasure and reward are activated. So when you're kind and compassionate, you feel good. And this is a huge, huge motivator. The other interesting thing is that when you are kind and compassionate, this means that your parasympathetic nervous system, that part of your vagus nerve, which is often called the rest and digest system, is activated. And when that part of the vagus nerve is activated, not only are you open and inclusive and thoughtful, but your physiology works its best. Your heart rate is decreased, your blood pressure is decreased, your heart rate variability is increased, your immune system is activated, the production of inflammatory proteins that are associated with chronic disease states are diminished. The levels of cortisol, which are associated with stress and have a very deleterious effect on the long term, are decreased. So when you act kind, compassionate, caring, this is actually benefiting you, and in fact is associated with an increase in longevity. Unlike the sympathetic nervous system, which is the other part of the vagus nerve, which is called the flight, fight, or freeze response. In this situation, which evolved to save our lives in certain situations in which our lives are threatened, a whole different series of events occur. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your pupils dilate, blood is diverted from your intestines into your skeletal muscles, your immune system is depressed, cortisol is released. And this activation of your sympathetic nervous system, which bypasses all other systems, is simply made for you to survive at that moment. Now, the sad thing is, unfortunately, in modern society, that system for many people is chronically activated on a low level, and that was really never meant to be the case. So you can see how practicing compassion has huge, huge physiologic benefits. And as you mentioned earlier, observing somebody being compassionate actually oftentimes results in you being compassionate.
So yes, I've read research where, and you mentioned these neurochemical rewards we get when we act compassionately, altruistically, releases dopamine, other pleasure chemicals, as well as all the other benefits you mentioned. And I've read research that says that just observing someone else act compassionately, altruistically, you experience some similar rewards. I'm wondering, is that the case? And if so, do we understand the mechanisms at play there?
Well, it is the case. And I would also say conversely, and sadly, when you act base, when you're selfish, this actually can motivate people to act similarly. And this is why we see actions by people who are performing very negative acts get encouraged by other people, or they encourage other people to do them. And so we all want to be accepted. And unfortunately, and I'm sure you've heard stories of actually, as an example, people who've joined gangs. They had no alternative if they were to be accepted or even survived other than to join a gang and participate in very negative behaviors. And in fact, were encouraged to do so and did not have insight or self-awareness or even the self-agency to respond to that. So oftentimes people act in a tribal fashion in a very negative way, as well as a very positive way. And if you look at our evolution as a species, where we evolved from the nuclear family to hunter-gatherer tribes, which is how we survived until 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, these were groups of 50 to 150 people. And they lived in a very hostile environment. So it was critically important that they work together and act together to survive. But, you know, unfortunately, we see that in modern society. And whether that translates into individuals who have the same, let's say, religious orientation or same level of financial wealth or other attributes, even those who are racist, they encourage each other to act the same way because people want to be connected. And in a tribal environment, whatever the tribe believes, you want to be part of that because it makes you feel like you're connected to everybody else. And of course, this can have very, very negative consequences, as we see in the context of our present political divisiveness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and what you're talking about clearly, our need to belong and so forth, and our genetic experience with coming up from the hunter-gatherer experience, and the literal need, survival need to belong. We can understand it in psychological terms, but if I'm understanding you correctly, also this operates at, kind of a sensory input level. And then because of the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, our brain is basically a learning machine. It learns and develops on whatever we expose it to. So if we're going to be exposed to a lot of, negativity in one form or another, or if we're exposed to others acting compassionately, altruistically, this actually impacts our brain and our development. And conversely, and it's part of our collective responsibility of the world. If we aspire to such things, we can model positive behaviors for others and make our contribution to it being a better world in that way.
No, I think that's exactly correct. When you act compassionately, again, as you pointed out, it has an impact on those around you. And this is very, very important. And it's, unfortunate that because of the need or desire to be accepted, people will also act in a very negative fashion. The other aspect, of course, is that so many people are judgmental of others. And this creates and amplifies this need to belong. You desperately want to be part of something. And again, we see politicians oftentimes manipulate this because if you create a fear narrative, then this makes people even more so want to be part of something that they feel will protect them. Of course, most of the fear negative is manufactured. It's not real. And the reality is, while there is this narrative that there's all this evil around us, the fact of the matter is that makes up a very, very small proportion of individuals. The vast majority of people are actually connected to themselves, their families, those surrounding them, and they want the world to be a better place. Like so many things, it's the 5% that actually pollutes the water, not the other 95%.
So you mentioned before that we have these these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. We have our fight or flight response and rest and digest and recovery, so forth response, parasympathetic, sympathetic. And, Dr. Dan Siegel talks about the window of tolerance. Stephen Porges and polyvagal work, keeping our social engagement systems online. So it seems like we're either operating in that fear and survival mode, which we're pretty much hardwired for, and we need it for our survival, still need to some degree, or we can relax into some kind of openness and operate in a more relational responsive mode with our social engagement systems online and so forth. And there's a lot of rewards for that, as you mentioned. It's going to, improve our immune system and improves our relation. There's a multiplicity of rewards. So we get the more time we can spend in that more relational, open, compassionate, altruistic, empathic mode. So what are some practices that you recommend or that the research demonstrates really can help us spend more time in that relational, empathic, compassionate mode? And so such that our brain actually changes and that becomes more our default way of being?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think the first thing you have to address is the reality that most of us are our worst critics. Mm-hmm. We will tell ourselves that we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we don't deserve love, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, if that is the narrative you keep repeating to yourself, then it's hard to look through the lens of compassion at those around you. You have a tendency oftentimes to be just as hypercritical with everyone else. So I think one of the first things to do is to change that narrative. Now, in traditional mindfulness practice, as you know, you oftentimes will do a body scan, and then you'll focus on an object, or in some cases use a mantra. But the statement is then that you don't, if you will, turn your head towards those negative comments. Because naturally, when you engage with a negative comment, this has a negative physiologic response. And this is in some ways why mindfulness works. The problem is that in many instances, just letting the words pass you by and not responding, it doesn't activate self-compassion. And one of the things that we've done through different courses we've developed, one being one that's now taught around the world, which is compassion cultivation training, is that we've actually taken it from just mindfulness to something I call mindfulness plus. And that's the incorporation overtly with the issue of self-compassion and then compassion for others. Because once you're kind to yourself and you change that narrative from one of negativity to self-affirmation, I am good enough, I'm worthy of love, then that then changes how you look at the world, from being hypercritical to understanding that people are frail, fragile human beings. They make mistakes. They're not perfect, and makes you much more accepting of them and realizing that everyone is suffering on some level, and also understanding that many of people's actions actually are a manifestation of baggage that they carry with them that has been present since their childhood, and they're not aware of it at a conscious level, but it drives their behavior. So, if you've grown up in an environment where somebody's been cold to you or ignored you or abused you, that sits with you. And this is why oftentimes you see adults, as an example, repeatedly developing codependent relationships with people, or in their jobs repeatedly having conflicts. It's not so much about the event at hand, it's the baggage that they carry that is actually making them have responses that are not evident to them at a conscious level. So one, being kind and compassionate to yourself, one, examining the drivers that have been present since your childhood oftentimes. And also one very important thing, and this is a quote that's attributed to Viktor Frankl, which is between stimulus and response, there is a pause, and within that pause lies your freedom. And what I mean by that is that if somebody is aggressive with us, without giving them the benefit of the doubt or understanding that there may be other drivers to their behavior, oftentimes we act aggressively back to them. And if you, though, pause, this then disconnects your sympathetic nervous system stimulus to allow for engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system stimulus, which means that you're open, you're thoughtful, you are understanding. And this allows for de-escalation or not engaging in these behaviors, which will have negative consequences.
There's a well-known Sikh teacher who taught in America, Yogi Bhajan, and I used to have a quote from him over my kitchen sink many years ago when I lived in Colorado. If I remember correctly, it was "Stop, don't react. Therein lies the entirety of our freedom." That ability to recognize that moment of freedom where we can choose something different. So, you mentioned before we have these different cognitive networks in the brain, attention network, default mode network, executive network, and so forth. And there's been a lot of talk about the default mode network of late. It's all these networks have their purpose, but in we modern humans, it tends to be overactive, and it's kind of that chatterbox part of our brain, ruminating about the past, worrying, fantasizing about the future, running commentary about the present. When people first try to learn to meditate, they say, I can't meditate because my mind's racing too much. It's all over the place. That's primarily the default mode network. And I realize I'm always in danger of oversimplifying things when talking about the brain, but at any rate, it seems that a lot of methodologies that can be helpful in terms of increasing neuroplasticity and moving the brain in a positive direction tend to take the default mode network a bit offline or suppress it a bit. That gives us more access to other aspects of the brain, including the current research into psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and stuff, but as well as just basic meditation, mindfulness and awareness meditation. So I wonder if you could talk about that relationship and how there may be various practices that we can do that'll naturally quiet the mind. We don't have to force the mind quiet or demonize it, but it will by focusing our attention, the mind will quiet down and we get access to other parts of the brain that may help build these reservoirs of trust and trust in our own goodness, trust in the goodness of others, compassion, altruism, and so forth.
No, I think that's exactly right. As you know, the default mode network is activated actually with mind wandering. And that in and of itself has some very positive benefits. But when you're engaged in a task, of course, that suppresses that. I think that these types of practices can allow you self-agency to take control of these processes in your brain. And as I mentioned, related to manifestation, we don't appreciate how much power each of us actually has. As you're aware, I'm sure, if you look at the ability of certain monks, as an example, to withstand cold or to change their heart rate. And this, of course, is through years of practice. Another example is Wim Hof. We have immense amounts of power. We just don't realize it. And this is part of the problem is people look for something external to make things happen. But the reality is it is the internal that makes things happen. And you actually can learn to control that. And these are just simply mental practices. As you point out, some people get lost in saying, I can't meditate, my mind is racing. You don't have to meditate traditionally to get these benefits. And what I mean by that is sitting on a mat with your eyes closed. The reality is simply sitting with your eyes closed and not worried about meditation in and of itself can be a meditative practice. And people don't realize this. They get lost in this idea that meditation is somehow a competition that you have to win. As you know, with Thich Nhat Hanh, of course, he talked about walking meditation. And frankly, you can get these types of benefits from simply walking in nature. You don't have to get lost in a performance that you believe is important. It's simply calming the mind and creating an environment where that's possible, and also understanding that you're worthy of love. And what I mean by that is that every person has this negative dialogue going in their head. That's unfortunately evolutionary baggage that is held over from our sympathetic response to threat. And you can't just learn to control that. And getting back to this Viktor Frankl quote, you just have to learn how to pause and not be reactive. And of course, a lot of this stuff is free to you. It's on the internet. There are different types of practices, and not necessarily simply meditative practices that allow you to understand your own self-agency, that offer you techniques to help you, quote unquote, get there. So there's not one road to Rome. There are many. And frankly, no one holds absolute truth. And what I mean by that is, you see a subset of people who demand that you do a mindfulness practice by sitting on a mat. And if you don't do it, you're not worthy. I can't tell you the number of times people have come to me and go, well, I just came back from my third 10-day Vipassana meditation. Like, well, why the hell do I care? Because if you ask me that question or made that statement, it means you got nothing out of your meditative practice, right? Again, this isn't a bragging rights contest. This is, how do I become a better person through these practices? How do I learn to self-regulate and be a better person? And that can sometimes simply just lying down, sitting in a chair, walking through nature, quieting your mind, and just be open to possibilities and allowing yourself to shift from the threat mode to the rest and digest mode.
Well, you mentioned some really for me is this really key there is the idea of self-regulation. I do a lot of work with corrections, law enforcement, probation and parole, the first responders, and we introduce very simple breathing techniques, very, very simple. Anybody can learn in a minute, that allow you to make that shift from an overactivated sympathetic response to a parasympathetic response. And they find it just life-changing because, I think maybe there's a bit of a demarcation between human beings, those who, probably a lot of people do it naturally, but still the idea that we have the self-agency to actually self-regulate our own our nervous system, knowing that, not knowing that changes everything in our life.
No, I think you're right. And thank you for bringing up the breathing exercise. And you're exactly correct. Simply inhaling, holding it briefly, and exhaling will shift you. And it's quite extraordinary. And again, this happens actually whether we like it or not, right? If you do that type of practice. And so again, yes, there are different ways to get to the same place. The goal is to allow each of us to get to the same place. And frankly, I gave that example of somebody saying how they did this and that type of mindfulness practice. It's like the same people who brag about their religion, right? My religion's right and everyone else's religion is wrong. There is no right or wrong religion. It's what is it that each of us can learn about ourselves that allow us to be the best person that we can be.
Well, just a little bit of a departure here. When I read your bio, mentioned that your book inspired the K-pop band BTS, one of I think their third album or something. Tell us a little bit about that connection and how that happened.
Well, I wish I could tell you I had anything to do with it. I did not whatsoever. And in fact, it was pointed out to me by someone ultimately. But having sort of researched BTS a little bit, all of their songs are oriented around loving yourself and caring for yourself and understand, if you will, that you're worthy. And this is why it has this universal appeal, not just in South Korea, but around the world, because they recognize that, one, all of us are suffering. Two, all of us want to be accepted and loved. And three, that we're imperfect beings. And in the face of that imperfection, we still deserve to be cared for and loved. You know, one of the philosophies that I certainly embrace is this concept of wabi-sabi, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as well as that of kintsugi. And for the audience who may not be familiar with these, wabi-sabi is a Japanese aesthetic, if you will, that talks about the nature of impermanence, incompleteness. And the other is kintsugi. And this is this concept that occurred in the 15th century when pottery was very valuable and it would break, and they would repair it in the sort of grotesque manner to hide, on the one hand, the fact that it was actually broken. But what ultimately happened is they ended up repairing it with resin that gold had been placed into. And it was a recognition that all of us are broken in some ways, and that you shouldn't hide that brokenness, because that's made you who you are. So by having these pieces of pottery that have these lines demonstrating that, in fact, they've been repaired, actually is very honorable. And in some ways, this is about the nature of authenticity and being who you are. And I think that's really important, because if you look at these areas in the world called blue zones, which I'm sure you're familiar with, these places, these 5 places in the world where typically people live to be over 100 years old, you know, everyone talks about the Mediterranean diet. And while the diet is important, while not consuming excessive alcohol or not smoking and getting exercise are important, by far and away, the most important aspect is human connection, depth of relationships. And this was also shown through the Harvard study that's been going on over 80 years. Those are the major components by far and away compared to other aspects. And the point of that is that in modern society, people are so fearful of being judged because, unlike the blue zones historically, where you've grown up in the village, you die in the village, everybody knows you, they know the good, the bad, and guess what? They still love you. In modern society, you don't have that level of support. You don't have your brothers or sisters or your grandparents or your parents nearby, and you're in an environment where people are terrified of being judged or making a mistake or being made fun of, and therefore they close off. Yet the only way that we can have these deep relationships is to be authentic and open. And it's scary sometimes because, of course, you can be judged. You know, it's funny, I give a lot of public lectures, and as you probably know, sometimes my voice will crack or I'll shed a tear. And I remember one time after one of these, a woman came up to me and she said, "I felt so sorry for you up there." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, your voice cracked and everybody was looking at you. You must have felt ashamed." And she said, "Listen, I'm a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, and you come to me for 3 sessions and I'll get rid of that." And I looked at her and I said, "That is who I am." And in some ways, that's, if you will, the secret sauce. Because you see, when I can show my own vulnerability, people don't look at me and feel that I'm not worthy. They actually want to embrace me and hug me, and it allows them to show their emotion. And I think that's the way we should all be. We shouldn't be afraid of being who we are. We shouldn't be afraid of being judged. And, from my own experience, frankly, I don't care what anybody thinks. I know who I am, and I'm okay. But I'm not perfect, and I make mistakes, and I'm sure I'll make many more. But I try to do the right thing.
Mm. And that sense of unconditional worthiness is hard won, and probably the greatest gift we can have in life. So I read that you've been very successful not only as a neurosurgeon, researcher, but you've also been a successful entrepreneur. You've done very well financially. And I read that you made the decision you've given, or you're giving away 90% of your wealth, considerable, over $30 million. And that's a pretty radical thing to do. And what inspired you to do that?
Well, if you talk to my wife, idiocy.
A different story. Yeah.
So, and I won't bore you with all the details, but you're correct. I was a successful entrepreneur, and I had made some commitments to charity, and suddenly during the dot-com crash, I lost $78 million in 6 weeks. And, I had a penthouse in San Francisco. I had Ferraris, Porsches, et cetera, et cetera. I had a home in Newport Beach. I had a villa in Florence. I was buying an island in New Zealand. I was having a very good time. And suddenly, it all came crashing down. And, when that happens, two people become your best friends. One, your banker, and the other's your lawyer. And I had actually borrowed $15 million because at that time, if you had stock in a company that had gone public, but you had a lock-in agreement, they would loan you up to a quarter of the value of that stock. So I took this loan for $15 million. And when everything crashed, and I was $3 million in the hole, they wanted their money back. Which I had to sell a variety of assets to do that. And the other thing that happened was the only asset I had left that had potentially any value was stock in a company that I had run, a medical device company. And I wanted to live up to the commitments that I had made. And I was speaking to my lawyers, and interestingly, I was informed that, in fact, they had screwed up and not completed the paperwork to give all the stock away. And in fact, that stock was ultimately worth $30 million. And I went through this deep period of reflection and decided to go ahead and give it all away. Now, I was not married at the time. In fact, I had just been dating my present wife for about 2 weeks. And she thought I was insane. But the way I looked at it was that, here I had gone, if you will, from rags to riches, being a neurosurgeon, entrepreneur, essentially having everything anybody could want, power, prestige, money. Yet each thing I did, whether it was to go to medical school or become a neurosurgeon, become a successful entrepreneur, I would climb this mountain and there was nothing there for me. I still had this feeling of emptiness, and it could not be filled. And so what happened is that when I lost everything, as I said, I went through this period of reflection, and in fact, the lessons that Ruth had taught me. And when I ended up giving everything away, in terms of money, I actually got everything. And what I mean by that is, look, my worst day, I'm a neurosurgeon. Right? It's not like I was living on the street. But when I gave everything away, it allowed me to get everything. And what I mean by that is that without having done all of those things, there would be no center at Stanford. I would not have the relationship I have with the Dalai Lama. I've been able to become friends with or confidants of actually many of the major spiritual and religious leaders in the world. I've had a huge impact in what we're talking about today in terms of positively affecting people's lives. There wouldn't have been a book. And so by giving all of that away, I got everything. And, the challenge for us is, and the sadness in modern society is there is a narrative that, geez, if I just had money, if I just had position, if I just had power, I would be happy. And as we all ultimately learn, none of that gives you happiness. All of us have an emptiness inside of us. And the reality is the only way we can fill that emptiness is through being of service to others, period. That's how we evolved as a species, caring for others. And that is the reality. And so when you are of service to others, when you give to others unconditionally without any expectation of receiving anything in return, that actually is when your physiology works its best. It's when you connect with people. And it also shows to other people what is possible for them. And so I may have one or two slight regrets about giving all that away because I still have to work for a living. And my wife says it was a bit rash, and it probably was. But that being said, at the end of the day, I don't have any regrets. I've been very blessed. I've been very fortunate on all sorts of levels. And, we were talking about manifestation. I think what the book actually is about is understanding the difference between what you think you need and what you actually need. And for many of us, that takes many, many years. The other aspect is an understanding that, yes, is it possible to manifest money and that's the problem with The Secret. It's a prosperity gospel that's pushing a narrative. It's about me, but it's not about you. The way to manifest is when you look at the world through how can I be of service? And that actually is the greatest likelihood for you to manifest. And when you do that, you get all the other stuff. And that's what people don't appreciate. It cannot be a self-centered intention. It has to be about being in service of others. And when you do that, you actually get everything.
Wow. What an extraordinary message and extraordinary life you've lived and you're living. Thank you so much for being part of our summit, Dr. Doty. It's just really an honor to connect with you and do this interview with you. And where can people find out more about your work? Where should we direct them?
Sure. So there are three places. One is ccare.stanford.edu. The other is actually a website called intothemagicshop.com, which obviously is named after my book. And it talks about the book and the new book. And actually, I didn't mention this, but I also have a podcast there that people might enjoy. Mm-hmm. And then jamesrdotymd.com, which is more a biographic narrative of different things that I've done. And certainly if people want to directly connect with me, you can certainly email me at jrdoty@stanford.edu. Wow.
Well, thank you so much for your generosity and everything you shared with us, Dr. Doty. Wishing you all the very best.